there was a group of men going around in a red van.
They'd go out and hunt for women.
To mutilate, kill, and remove their breasts for what they said were satanic rituals.
All four of them had the same desire.
They had the same pathology, which makes it such an extreme case.
He was the mastermind of this operation.
You know, this is the nature of evil.
What happened to these four guys?
Chicago. With a population of almost 3 million, this is the third largest city in the United States. Built on the shores of Lake Michigan and nicknamed the Windy City, this town's history, like that of most of the country's capitals, is in turn luminous and dark. Known throughout the world for its avant-garde architecture, its prestigious museums, and its exceptional symphony orchestra, this city has a dark past. It is here that in 1893, Dr. H.H. Holmes built his infamous Castle of Death, where he may have killed over 200 people. The first serial killer in United States history claimed he'd been possessed by the devil since birth. In the mid-20s, Al Capone established Chicago as the theater for his criminal operations. And it is also here, in a Chicago suburb, that John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, tortured and murdered at least 33 victims during the 70s. On June 1st, 1981, policemen from DuPage County will unknowingly open a new chapter in Chicago's tattered history. They're escorting Hank McGinnis, manager of the Brer Rabbit Motel, to a clearing next to his establishment where he has found a corpse.
A woman was found in a ditch near a motel.
We start out with a dead woman assaulted sexually and mutilated.
The Brer Rabbit in Villa Park, a working-class suburb of Chicago, is a seedy establishment that's a well-known hangout for prostitutes. That morning, after an employee complains about a sickening smell coming from a nearby field, Hank McGinnis discovers the body of a young black woman, lying face down in the tall grass. Vosberg and Wilcox notice that the woman's hands are handcuffed behind her back, and that a broken key still juts out from the lock.
So we know that we have someone out there who is really dangerous.
The woman is still wearing her t-shirt, but her panties have been pulled down to mid-thigh. Agent Thomas Vosberg finds a few rolled-up banknotes and some loose change in one of her stockings, a little over $13.
So clearly, robbery was not the motive.
From the state of the body, the agents conclude that the woman must have died several weeks ago. And yet, the forensic examiner, Dr. David Barrett, establishes the time of death to be as recent as 3 or 4 days ago, and identifies the body as that of Linda Sutton, a young 21-year-old prostitute.
The woman was horribly mutilated and abandoned there. As both her breasts had been cut off, vermin had infested the corpse. Although her death was recent, decomposition was at a very advanced stage when she was discovered.
During the following months, 5 additional women's bodies are discovered in the greater Chicago area.
And then we started finding more victims, and it just escalated.
By the time the women were found, they were so badly decomposed that one could not tell what was the cause of death.
Several of them show signs of similar mutilations to those of Linda Sutton. They have been raped, tortured, and mutilated.
They not only raped these women, but while they were alive, cut off their breasts. This all seems to be kind of a put down, a debasing of women.
Even if everything points towards the existence of a serial killer in Chicago, the police have not yet made a connection between the deaths of Linda Sutton and the 4 other victims.
All these kind of sadistic acts, these mutilatory acts against these women was pretty distinctive. And these crimes basically had these kind of attacks in common.
We had to make a determination if the similarities of the victims found outside of Chicago were sufficiently obvious to be connected to the kinds of injuries suffered by the victims found in Chicago.
On May 15, 1982, Lorraine Borowski, a real estate agent from Elmhurst, another Chicago suburb, also disappears.
Lori Borowski, who was walking to her job early in the morning in Elmhurst, when she was snatched.
A purse and a pair of shoes next to the curb in front of a real estate. That's all that was there.
5 months later, on October 10, 1982, a teenager finds the body of a young woman concealed at the end of an alleyway in Clarendon Cemetery in Villa Park.
Months later, they find the girl, all decomposed again.
According to the medical examiner, the young woman has had her left breast amputated and been stabbed several times. The coroner identifies the victim as Lorraine Borowski.
Detectives, especially one, his name is Warren Wilcox, was almost positive that the people he's looking for were from Chicago.
2 weeks after Lorraine Borowski's murder, 30-year-old Shui Mak also disappears.
She was born and raised in China. She was brought here. She lived with her parents. She worked in a company somewhere in DuPage County where they made Mars lights, you know, for squads, electrical company. She did that 8 hours a day and then went to her family's restaurant and worked there.
On the night of her disappearance, as she is coming home from work with her brother Kent, a heated argument breaks out between them. Kent orders her out of the car at a stop sign. It's 1:30 in the morning. That night, Shui Mak will not get home.
She walked southbound on Barrington Road from Schaumburg Road because it was the only way she knew how to get home.
The Cook County Police Department is tasked with the investigation into the young Chinese woman's disappearance. On September 30th, Shui Mak's body is discovered on a construction site in South Barrington, an upscale Chicago suburb in Cook County.
She was as close as I am to you to an anthill, and there was nothing left. No body parts. But again, the clothes were on, and this beautiful necklace was on her. The back of her skull was crushed, and she had a tooth crack in the front. So it would seem that somebody punched her, and her head went back and shattered.
Bits of steel wire are found next to the body. Detective Troca from the Sheriff's Office of Cook County is charged with identifying the victim. This is a crime scene he will never forget.
We processed the scene, and at that moment, I was trying to identify her.
The discovery of Shui Mak's body convinces the various Chicago area police departments that they're dealing with a serial killer, or worse, with a group of serial killers.
Well, as soon as we had 2 or 3 victims, we could determine that this was the work of the same person or persons.
The investigators review the various case files. One testimony stands out. In June of the preceding year, Holly Clemens, aka Angel York, a prostitute from the red light district, had told about boarding a van driven by a prospective John.
He picked her up when she was running away from the police when they were sweeping the area for prostitutes, got in his van, and then found herself in much more trouble than she was trying to escape.
He forces her aboard his van and orders her to take off her clothes.
He wound up having her cut a hole in the side of her breast, which he then enlarged with his finger and the knife, because it wasn't large enough to encompass his penis. And he had sex with the breast.
After this interminable aggression, he leaves her in an alleyway near Grand Avenue.
Fortunately, he let her out. He put some duct tape over her breast, let her out of the van.
She is discovered 5 minutes later and driven to the hospital where her condition is stabilized. On August 27th, another black prostitute is found dead and mutilated on the shores of the Chicago River.
There was a woman found under a bridge. I believe it was Fullerton Avenue Bridge. A man was there collecting cans, bottles, whatever, and found her body.
Sandra Delaware had her hands tied behind her back and had also had her left breast amputated.
They would use a piano wire to sever one or both breasts.
On September 8th, Rose Beck Davis, a 30-year-old woman, is discovered behind a public housing complex near North Lakeshore Drive.
Slashing her chest with a hatchet that Robert had, and using the handle of the hatchet to destroy her vagina, basically. Shove the handle of this axe into her vagina.
The examiner would later find pieces of wood in her vagina, most likely from the handle of a makeshift axe. Investigators are baffled by these cases.
These offenders did not use race as a discriminatory consideration because there were both white and black women involved. So
neither victim is ever really chosen. Driving down the road, a woman is out of gas. Bang, she disappears. We forget about her, and in a couple of weeks, we find her mutilated in a field, a seedy lot, a car.
Regardless of the cause of death, we had murdered women's bodies on our hands, and we had to find the people responsible for it.
Beverly Washington, a young 20-year-old prostitute, is found near a Chicago railway line. Despite the severity of her injuries, the young black woman is still breathing.
The investigation finally takes a turn in the right direction when a kidnapped victim survives her injuries. Even though at first glance she seems to be dead, she had had to amputate her own breast with the knife.
She is immediately taken to the hospital where doctors stabilize her condition. From her hospital bed, she tells her story.
Beverly Washington was acting as a prostitute that night.
On the night of her attack, she climbs aboard a red van driven by a man around 25.
She gave a description of the offender having a red van with dark seats and feathers hanging from what she thought was a rearview mirror. In fact, there wasn't a rearview mirror, but the feathers were where a rearview mirror would have been.
The man drives her to a deserted location and suggests they go to the rear of the van, set up like a carpenter's workshop.
She described this red van and being taken into the back of the van because the back had a wooden partition and it had shelves on either side. And the back of the van was totally secluded. There were no windows, there were no openings.
He threatens her into taking off her clothes. He forces her to her knees to perform oral sex on him. The man first orders her, then forces her to swallow a handful of pills. From that point on, Beverly gradually loses consciousness.
Beverly Washington said that he gave her a bunch of pills to knock her out, and when she woke up,
she had her breast dissected.
After Holly Clemens' story, from June of the preceding year, Beverly Washington's account is the second time a red van is clearly associated with the Chicago Mutilators' crimes. 3 weeks later, agents Phil Murphy and Tom Flynn from Chicago PD intercept a van that fits Beverly Washington's description perfectly.
What Miss Washington said about a feather or some type of device hanging from the rearview mirror would, of course, have been helpful to identify the van.
Coincidentally, the police just happened to come across the van that corresponded to the victim's description. They stopped the van.
Unfortunately, the driver doesn't fit the description given by the victims. The man is called Eddie Spreitzer, and he's just 21. He says the van doesn't belong to him, but rather to his boss, a man named Robin Gecht, a building contractor.
The van is driven by someone named Spreitzer. He says, yeah, I only drive the van, but I can take you to see my boss, Mr. Gecht.
The investigators give him back his ID and tell him they plan to follow him to the construction site where they want to talk to his boss. Once there, the policemen are met by Robin Gecht. And note that he fits Beverly Washington's description perfectly.
When I met Robin Gecht, I found him to be a scrawny little man that is just a little bit weak. I also found him to be dislikable.
Gecht is quite the snob with the police. In fact, he says, you want to speak to me? Speak to my lawyer.
The man is perfectly calm and relaxed. When Detective Phil Murphy tells him that his van may have been involved in a crime, Gecht is unmoved. He even adds that he is ready to collaborate with the police should this be true. Robin Gecht, Eddie Spreitzer, and 2 other employees from the building site are then taken to the brigade offices of Chicago Police's 5th District. All of them categorically deny involvement in any kind of criminal activity. Murphy and Flynn then return to Beverly Washington's bedside. She is still hospitalized at Chicago General Hospital. Although it's been 3 weeks since her terrible ordeal, she still has a very detailed memory of her aggressor. And when the officers show her a picture of Robin Gecht, she recognizes him without hesitation. Robin Gecht, 29, is arrested and formally accused of assault and attempted murder on the person of Beverly Washington. Robin Gecht is born on November 30th, 1953, at the Advocate Illinois Masonic Medical Center in Chicago. Not long after his birth, he is remanded to the care of his paternal grandparents, Reuben and Sarah Gecht, with whom he'll enjoy a quiet childhood.
Many children are raised by their grandparents and become completely normal, completely adequate. The fact that he has developed such traits is more complex and goes beyond the simple fact of being raised by his grandparents.
At 22, Robin marries Rosemary McCaffrey, then starts his own construction company.
Robin Gecht was a businessman who had a construction company.
Robin Gecht was the boss. He was the carpenter. And Robin Gecht owned the van. He owned the company with his wife, Rose.
He was married, had kids, apparently was abusive to his wife to some extent.
Rosemary soon discovers her husband's abusive sexual practices. Besides being forced to accept his numerous infidelities, she also has to submit herself to Robin's various perverse sexual practices, including sadism.
He is obviously someone who takes pleasure in making his victims suffer, making women suffer. It all started by inflicting physical abuse to his own wife.
He got his wife to let her stick pins in her breast. He got his girlfriend to do the same thing and let her burn her breasts. I mean, where do you find women that are willing to do that? I mean, how does that come across?
Unfortunately, some women feel helpless around their husbands. They feel dependent. They don't have the strength to leave and face being alone.
As if these practices weren't enough to satisfy him, Robin Gecht will soon turn to perfect strangers, ideal subjects for his macabre fantasies. In the offices of the investigators for the 5th District, Robin Gecht categorically denies any involvement in the attack on Beverly, Washington.
Gecht is condescending with the police and says he's not concerned. The story does not concern him.
Gecht is a gifted manipulator, and policemen soon realize they'll get nothing out of him. They then turn to Eddie Spreitzer, who is himself in preventive custody. The young 22-year-old is visibly nervous and sweats profusely.
Edward Spreitzer was very goofy, and I know that he panicked when he heard that Robin Gecht was in the next room while he was being interrogated.
As soon as he hears his boss's name, he flinches on his chair.
Robin Gecht was a very dominating boss and a very dislikable boss. So they did everything that they had to do, and they may have been abused by him to some extent as an employee.
Eddie Spreitzer is obviously terrified by Robin Gecht's personality, and the investigators exploit that weakness. They tell him that he can expect nothing from Robin, and that he has accused him of everything, starting with the savage aggression on Beverly, Washington.
They interrogate Spreitzer with such intensity that he cracks. Spreitzer writes out a report in which he admits some of the crimes, etc., etc. In a report that covers over 70 pages. It's enormous. Truly enormous.
He will describe for hours how he accompanied Robin Gecht on his murderous rampages, how he witnessed his acts of violence, and talks about Gecht's intense obsession with breasts.
Robin Gecht says he is a breast man. There are plenty of men in this world that are breast men, obsessed with breasts, or love breasts, or fetish on breasts, paraphilia. You know, there are some people who are paraphilias.
He wanted to know what was inside breasts, how they worked, what their purpose was. It was an obsession with breasts far beyond the normal.
Most men obsessed with breasts don't go around cutting breasts off.
And the man was clearly a sadist. He seemed to enjoy hurting people.
Using his boss's van, he claimed they had abducted and tortured at least 7 women. In general, it was Robin who finished the job by severing one of the victim's breasts before masturbating in the open wound. He also claimed Gecht had even forced him to do the same to 2 or 3 of the victims. Upon hearing this story, Agents Murphy and Wilcox are stunned. And then, just as he is about to sign his confession, Spreitzer recants.
Edward Spreitzer would go from love to spring. Yes, it was Robin Gecht. No, it wasn't my boss. Yes, it was.
He will finally maintain the crimes were orchestrated by a third man, one Andrew Corcoralis.
Andy was implicated by Eddie Spreitzer. That was the first time Andy's name was ever brought into the investigation.
That same night, Agents Warren Wilcox and Tom Flynn proceed to arrest Andrew Corcoralis. a young 23-year-old living in Villa Park, a suburb near the location where Linda Sutton's body had been found in June of 1981.
Mr. Kokorales voluntarily came to Area 5, where he was interrogated.
It isn't long before Kokorales confesses to participating in different crimes and rituals.
For hours, Andrew Kokorales describes in detail some of the most horrible crimes ever committed in the Chicago area.
Andy Kokorales confessed to his participation and involvement in the murder of Rose Beck Davis and other murders.
Robin Gecht was always present when these murders occurred, and Eddie Spreitzer was present on a number of them.
Spreitzer knew the Kokorales brothers, and so the four of them together were the Ripper crew.
There were different combinations of these men.
They would sometimes go 4, 3, or 2.
When he did this attack on Beverly, Washington, Robin Gecht was alone. That was not the usual circumstance.
They'd go out and hunt for women. There was always just one driving. The other one, or the others, were in the back. And they would get to the spot where things were going to start.
And they wound up killing and mutilating, in many cases, a number of women, many of whom were not prostitutes, and who really simply had the misfortune to encounter these men when they were out looking for victims.
The way these individuals operated was based on satisfying their needs. Their first need was not getting caught. The second one was the manner in which their needs were satisfied, inflicting pain on women, making them suffer. Basically, they got sexually aroused by inflicting pain and suffering.
Andrew Kokorales also tells how Robin Gecht, Eddie Spreitzer, and himself forced young Shui Mak to get aboard their van.
He mentions about punching her in the face. Well, that's where the tooth broke. That's where the back of the head shattered.
Once unconscious, they brought her to a construction site near Barrington. As the young Asian girl had very small breasts, Gecht decided not to amputate, which didn't stop them from carrying on a macabre ritual. Robin made several deep incisions in her chest, and the three men took turns penetrating the wounds with their penises. Gecht finally strangled young Shui Mak with a piece of steel wire.
We looked in the van, and we saw a piece of wire that looked like this. This being twisted and can be used as a handle, and this could have been put under the throat.
At this stage, Kokorales knows he has said too much and cannot turn back. He then speaks about the other victims,
including the murder of Rose Beck Davis, including the murder of Lori Borowski, I believe, including the murder of Linda Sutton out behind the Brer Rabbit Motel.
He will leave out no sordid detail.
It does make you wonder how you find people that are willing to do that.
It probably is a lot easier to find 3 people who will go rob banks with you than it is to find 3 other people who will go and sexually assault, kidnap women, sexually assault them, mutilate them, and then kill them. I mean, that is really at the far end of depravity when you think about it.
When you think about it, it's absolutely inconceivable.
It's already unusual to meet a sexual sadist who mutilates his victims in this manner, who tortures them, who kills them. That's extremely rare. A group of 4 sharing the same pathology is even rarer. Hopefully, we'll never see this again.
Less than 48 hours after Andrew's arrest, Agent Warren Wilcox returns to the Corcoralis family home. This time to question Thomas, Andy's younger brother.
Okay.
Corcoralis also talks about his brother Tommy, the town's simpleton. Tommy didn't know everything, but he did participate. The police interrogated him.
When Agent Wilcox mentions Andy, Eddie Spreitzer, and Robin Gecht, Tommy becomes agitated, turns away, and avoids his gaze. Wilcox knows that that type of behavior means he's hiding something. The policeman asks him if he'd agree to a lie detector test, and Thomas accepts. At Elmhurst Brigade headquarters, Thomas Corcoralis takes a polygraph test, which he fails miserably. Once confronted to that fact, Tommy confesses to everything.
It wasn't hard to get confessions from Thomas Corcoralis because he had a low IQ and he really was easily persuaded to tell the truth.
He explains that his brother Andrew, Edward Spreitzer, and himself are part of a satanic group led by Robin Gecht.
From the hand of all his enemies, from the hand of Sauron.
Black Mass is just the exact opposite of a Catholic Mass. The crosses are upside down, you know, that kind of stuff.
I said to the Lord.
In a specially prepared room in Gecht's attic, he claims to have participated in macabre rituals.
In secret, when his wife was at work, he would bring the victim body parts to this chapel and participate in satanic rituals.
Some of the rituals involved sliced women's breasts,
which sometimes they had masturbated into while they were still in the band, and they would cut it up and use it as if it were like the body of Christ. Is a satanic ritual, and that was for some kind of empowerment and magical properties apparently associated with the breast. So then they would also masturbate on the breast as part of the ritual.
Once they had finished masturbating, Gecht cut up the victim's breasts, and everyone ate a part of the poor woman's mutilated chest.
The manner in which the mutilated women's breasts were collected demonstrates an extremely rare form of fetishism.
He claimed their group had abducted a number of women in the Chicago area in order to assault, mutilate, and murder them.
How many there were, we're not sure. There could be as many as 18. Certainly, some of the victims were definitely identified, but not all 18.
Corcoralis will confess having seen up to 15 breasts in a box where Gecht kept his trophies.
If there were trophy boxes and there was this attic filled with occult-like material, surely that would have come up in at least one of the trials. And according to my knowledge, it hasn't come up in any trial. And that would have been hard evidence to prove he did it. But why it didn't come up in trial is a mystery to me.
There was a motion in limine, a pretrial motion made by the defense that the prosecution should not raise that in the trial. And we agreed to it because we had no evidence.
Any mention of the occult was by just happenstances that came out in the statements made by Andy Corcoralis. But it was not the focus of the trial.
Over the course of his confession, Tommy will recognize that he is convinced that Robin Gecht possesses supernatural powers and that he is connected to the Lord of the Underworld.
The others attribute occult powers to him. People are warned against looking into Gecht's eyes.
Never look him in the eye because he'll make you do things. He has magical powers, so just never look him in the eye.
When police get to Robin Gecht's home at 2163 North McVicker Avenue to confirm Thomas Corcoralis' story, they find this infamous secret room set up in the attic.
In the attic of his house, the police find a temple that is adorned with decorations and symbols that qualify as satanic.
Investigators also find a number of books on Satanism, empty trophy boxes, as well as a shotgun. Ballistic experts confirm it's been shot recently. The Chicago Rippers case occurred at the very start of what sociologists will later call the Satanic Panic.
People were overreacting to the influence of Satanism upon common culture. And when these crimes happened, people did panic and they were upset. But typically because these types of crimes, the satanic crimes, were typically grievous and shocking in nature.
When the FBI starts its enquiry into the activities of satanic groups, without going as far as to say that such crimes don't exist, it describes them as being exceptionally rare, and that in most cases, they are perpetrated by small, poorly organized groups under the influence of a charismatic leader, such as Charles Manson or Robin Gecht.
Robin Gecht has no aura whatsoever. Nothing like what I know of Charles Manson with his evil aura that he had.
Whether he was manipulating them or whether they were just enjoying what was going on, Robin Gecht knew what levers to push to get all of those men to do what he wanted them to do.
When someone allows himself to do something, there are people who only fantasize about it. And this fantasy may never come true. But when someone makes it concrete, they're ready to follow. If there had been no leader, maybe the others would never have done it. At the very instant that someone made it possible and concrete, people with the same perversion voluntarily followed, without a doubt.
With the arrest of Robin Gecht, Eddie Spreitzer, and the brothers Andrew and Thomas Corcoralis, the various Greater Chicago police departments are convinced they've put an end to the activities of that quartet of monsters, justly nicknamed by the press as the Chicago Rippers.
The name Chicago Ripper was a media creation, but it was, I guess, derived from the fact that it was mutilations and murders of prostitutes, at least in part, and that was a similarity to the Jack the Ripper in London.
After they were all arrested and in custody, there were no more such horrific murders and attacks on women in Chicago.
The fate of the four is in the hands of their judges. Robin Gecht will be the first one to face justice.
It is quite obvious that the leader had some influence over the others. Although the others were intimidated by him, they were also impressed by the leader.
These guys were genuinely afraid of the repercussions of them actually turning him in because they thought he did have magical powers as a result of these rituals. And I'm not sure they ever, stopped believing that.
They looked up to him, apparently. They followed his lead.
Whatever influence he had over these other three people was a significant influence.
In Gecht's case, the other suspects all recant, one after the other, in order to protect him.
None of the others would testify against him. They actually were quite afraid of him. They thought that he could do things to them even though he was locked up. They were pretty superstitious, so they would not testify against him. As a result, they didn't have direct evidence to implicate Gecht in murder, only in assault because there was a witness against him.
The testimony of the two survivors attests to the sadism of Robin Gecht, who just a few feet away is still claiming innocence.
With all the information that we have on him, psychopath is an appropriate diagnosis for it, without a doubt. We also know that lying comes very easily to this type of people.
I was never involved in the murder cases, nor did I know.
Nor were you involved with rape?
No, I never knew. If you're involved in murders, you had to be involved with the rape. I didn't.
He does not deny his participation in various rituals, but he denies any involvement in crimes and murders, and he has never amputated a woman's breast.
Robin Gecht innocent? It's laughable.
But the jury isn't fooled. After deliberation, Gecht is found guilty of attempted rape, aggravated assault, and murder.
He received a sentence of 120 years, which was maximum extended sentencing for the Class X felonies of attempt murder and kidnapping and deviant sexual assault and rape. The judge gave to the offender, he got to serve half of it. So 60 years, so 60 and 28. He'll be 88 when he gets out, unless they change the law, and I sure hope they don't.
Thomas Corcoralis, who has the least involvement of the four in this series of crimes, is convicted of participating in the murder of Lorraine Borowski, the young Remax real estate agent murdered in May of 1982 in Elmhurst.
Thomas Corcoralis was sentenced to 70 years in prison.
So at some point he'll be eligible for parole.
Andrew Corcoralis is the next one to stand trial, although he's been very vocal just a few months before for agents Warren Wilcox and Tom Flynn. He claims to have absolutely no recollection of the attacks.
Andy took a consistent position that he was not even involved in any murders. He did not plead guilty. He contested the charges very vigorously in court. Eddie Spreitzer and Robin Gecht did not testify against him. The evidence implicating Andy Corcoralis came from the oral and written statements that he had made to the police. And that was certainly enough evidence to prosecute the case without the testimony of any co-defendants.
That jury imposed the death penalty on Andy Corcoralis, and he was, in fact, the last person executed in Illinois.
He is executed by lethal injection on March 17, 1999, at Tams Correctional Center. Eddie Spreitzer is the last one to face justice. On March 2, 1984, he pleads guilty to the charges of murdering Rose Beck Davis, Sandra Delaware, and Shui Mack.
I testified against Spreitzer. So I told my story about my involvement with Shui Mack.
Eddie Spreitzer pled guilty and received a life sentence.
In another trial, he will also plead guilty to the charges of kidnapping, raping, and murdering Linda Sutton.
He was also prosecuted in DuPage County and received a death sentence there.
Spreitzer was to be executed, and he got off.
Spreitzer's sentence was commuted when the governor commuted all death sentences, so he has life in prison without parole.
Eddie Spreitzer will never get out of his cage.
Robin Gecht is still alive, and Eddie Spreitzer is still alive, and all these victims are dead, and their families have suffered with their loss. And justice, I thought, meant that they should have died.
The jury came to a just verdict and a just imposition of the life imprisonment.
I don't really know what they got out of it exactly, except other than the obvious, but clearly, whatever they got was sufficient for them to continue to do it, because they didn't stop. They didn't do one and say, well, you know, they're not for me, you know, this is too much. Upon reflection, they kept on going out with him in the van looking for victims, and they found them, and they did horrible things to them. And, you know, this is the nature of evil.
An Indian proverb reminds us that even the devil needs a friend. When it comes to the Chicago Rippers, he found 4, and one of them has since joined him in hell.
Whatever we are now, we've learned as a child what happened to these 4 guys.
It is like the most extreme that I was ever exposed to in my career as a law enforcement officer.
They're all in prison. There'll be no more victims out in society caused by these men.